Good morning and welcome to Wednesday of our devotional series entitled 8 Days That Changed the World. We are every day this week looking at the steps of Jesus during this 8-day period at the end of his earthly life and ministry, what he did on Monday, what he did on Tuesday, and we're up to Wednesday in our study. I've said earlier that Jesus' life, this last 8-day period, was very busy. There were a lot of important events that took place during this part of his life. In fact, we have more records in the Bible of what happened in this 8-day period than any other part of Jesus' life. If you look at the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'll find that 25% of what was written in those three books is pertaining to this 8-day period of Jesus' life. And if you go to the Gospel of John, it's even more pronounced, where almost 50% of what John wrote is concerned with this 8-day period of Jesus' life and ministry. So we had lots of biblical record about this part of Jesus' life every day except for Wednesday. There is no clear record in the Bible of what Jesus might have done on Wednesday. There's just not. There's speculation. There's some good logical assumptions that I'll talk about in just a minute, but there's no place in the Bible that we can look to and point to this verse and says this conclusively happened on Wednesday. Now, why do you think that is? Why do you think there's no record there for us to know for sure? I've read what the scholars have written, and I have a tendency to agree with what the majority of them say. They say that Wednesday was a day of rest for Jesus, that Jesus spent Wednesday in Bethany resting up. And that makes perfect sense if you think about Jesus' schedule at this point. He had spent 3 very busy, full, stressful days up until this point. Remember on Sunday, Palm Sunday, that we talked about a few days ago, there was this very dramatic entry into Jerusalem that Jesus made, declaring himself to be the Messiah. And after that emotional event, he spent some time there in the temple before he went back to Bethany to spend the night. And then on Monday morning, he went back to Jerusalem and he went to the temple, we know, went to the house of God, and he found something there that was very, very disturbing. The house of prayer, as he said, had become nothing more than the equivalent of a first century flea market. They had turned it into what he called a den of thieves. And so he reacted very forcibly about that. He drove out those thieves from the temple. And so that was an intense, emotional scene from Jesus. And I'm sure he was emotionally spent after that. And then on Monday evening, he went back to Bethany. Tuesday morning, we find him back in Jerusalem again for what I call the day of confrontation, because on Tuesday, he made sure that he met with these priests there in the temple. And he said some things. He presented himself in such a way that they would condemn him and be forced to conclude that he should be guilty of a capital offense, something that would lead to his death. And then the rest of the day on Tuesday, he spent in this very long section of teaching that we call the Olivet Discourse. And so Tuesday was a long day, Monday was a long day, Sunday was a long day, very demanding time. And so he was resting up from that. And so the logical conclusion that most scholars make is that Jesus spent Wednesday resting in Bethany. Remember, pay attention, Jesus was the God-man. He was flesh and blood in his humanity, right? He was the God-man. That doesn't mean he was half God and half man. He was 100% God and 100% man. And don't ask me to explain that because I can't, but I believe it because that's what the Bible says. But in his humanity, his flesh and blood, Jesus got tired. He really did. In fact, we read of his humanity in the New Testament. He got tired. He got hungry. He got thirsty. He got physically weak. He wept. He got angry righteously. He was fully human, flesh and blood. And so it's totally logical and reasonable for us to conclude that on Wednesday he rested, not only from the 3 days that he had just experienced, but in anticipation of the 3 days that would come. He knew what was coming in the next few days. And so he probably rested in Bethany. Now think about where that might have happened. We know of two places that Jesus had spent time in Bethany. One was at the home of a man the Bible calls Simon the leper. If you remember that account, it was in Simon's home that Mary lovingly anointed Jesus' feet with that precious ointment, that very expensive perfume, and dried his feet with her hair. And so we know that Jesus spent at least that time in the home of Simon the leper. But he also spent more time in the home of these two sisters, Mary and Martha, and their brother named Lazarus. Lazarus, of course, was the one that Jesus had raised back to life after he had been dead for 3 days. And Jesus considered these three to be his friends, and he loved being in that home. It was a place of rest and relaxation for him. And so it was probably there that he spent a low-key, quiet day on Wednesday, resting and recuperating. And so let's think about this idea of rest before we conclude here. We don't talk about rest a whole lot in our hurry up and busy world that we live in. We often think of rest as time wasted. And I wonder if some of us don't even wonder if Jesus might have been wasting this time on Wednesday in his rest. After all, he only had a short period of time left, right? He only had a few days in his earthly ministry. Would that not have been time well spent preaching the gospel and teaching the truths of the kingdom and trying to reach people? Did it ever enter your mind that maybe Jesus could have used this time more wisely? Rest, as a matter of fact, is a gift to us from God. Rest is not time wasted. There is a spiritual aspect to rest as well as a physical aspect to rest. You know that in the beginning, in the creation account, that after God worked for 6 days to create the universe, on the seventh day, the Bible said that he rested. And God didn't rest because he was physically exhausted or because he needed to rest. He rested as an example for us, as a pattern for us. We work hard, but then we rest. And then we have in the Ten Commandments, of course, God telling us to take one day and make that a different kind of day, a day of rest for the soul, for the spirit, and for the body, a day of worship, a day of restoration. Jesus himself would say in the New Testament, that admonition to those who were weary physically and spiritually, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you" what? "I will give you rest." And even heaven is spoken of. You can look in the book of Hebrews and the book of Revelation. Heaven is spoken of as a place of rest, a place where our labors will cease. And so don't think of rest as time wasted. There's a spiritual aspect to rest. God gave us rest. It is for our good. He gave it to us so that we could have our body and our spirit and our mind restored. And so rest is not a weakness. It's not always time spent poorly. Now, the Bible does say in the book of Proverbs and other places that we ought to work, and laziness is condemned. But also rest is commended to us. But as I close, let me give you this admonition. The most important rest that there is for us, for any person, is spiritual rest. The most important rest we can experience is that resting in Jesus. That's when we quit striving, when we stop trying to fulfill some kind of standard in order to make ourselves right with God, and we rest in him. We rest in what Jesus has accomplished on the cross for us. That's really what Jesus was talking about when he said, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden." Listen, the most weary people in the world today are not those whose bodies are physically tired, but whose souls are spiritually tired from trying to be good enough to come to God. Jesus gives us spiritual rest by what he did on the cross. Thank you for joining us on Wednesday of Holy Week, on Wednesday of the 8 days that changed the world. We'll see you tomorrow on Thursday.